Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. And thank you very much to Dr. Andrew Miller. This is your Adult Services Librarian, Laura. Tonight, we are going to be talking about mushrooms of Illinois. And the presenter is Dr. Andrew Miller. He is the mycologist and director of the Herbarium and Fungarium at the Illinois Natural History Survey at the University of Illinois. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Dr. Miller.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to speak tonight on what I find is an interesting topic, the different mushrooms that we find throughout Illinois. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and present my talk tonight, which is, it's about an hour-long talk in person, but it may go faster on Zoom, so we'll see. Sorry, I'm not sure how I muted myself, but okay. So here's my outline for my talk tonight. It's introduction to fungi is how I'll start off. And then I'm going to talk about the major groups of mushrooms. And then we will revisit these again and come back and look at some of the more edible and poisonous species. Whoops. Okay. So this is a pie chart that shows basically all of life on Earth, more or less, all the different organisms. And as you can see, the largest piece of pie is colored here in blue. It's the insects. And what we see are shadings on the inside and the outside. And what those mean are the number of species roughly that's been described is the shading on the inside, and then what's left to be described is the shading on the outside. So if we take a look at this second largest piece of pie here, known as the fungi, it's in brown here. It's the second largest piece, and fungi are actually the second largest group of eukaryotic organisms on Earth, next to the insects. And we believe there's somewhere around 1.5 million species estimated to occur. But we've only described 120,000 species so far. So we have a long way to go. So how many fungi are there? And like I just said, there's estimated to be over 1.5 million worldwide. If we now switch to just the United States and we switch our vocabulary from fungi to mushrooms, so those bigger, more charismatic things that you usually find and photograph, there's probably about 20,000 mushrooms in the US. Of course, if you add in all the microfungi, the really small things, there's a lot more. And then when we're talking about Illinois and just mushrooms, we're talking around 2,000 species of mushrooms in Illinois. So you can kind of imagine that if someone takes a picture of a brown mushroom, I have a 1 in 2,000 chance of getting it correct, right? So it's not the easiest thing to identify these things. There's a lot of them out there. Oops. All right. So this is a nice little flow chart from this book, Mushrooms, Poisons, and Panaceas. And what we see is there's around 100,000 described species, probably around 120,000 is what I should say. 20,000 fleshy macrofungi or mushrooms. And then there's 3 branches we can take, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly here. So if we start off on the left side, we see that there's around 400 species that are probably poisonous, right? They all haven't been tested yet, but we suspect they're probably poisonous. And there's 20 common species of these that are poisonous. But really, when you break it down, out of the 120,000 described species, there's really less than 6 that are lethal species, which, you know, your Ammonites, some of your Gallerinas, the things that would actually kill you. So if we look on this right side now and kind of flow down more towards the 2,000 species that are probably edible, in the middle we see there's about 100 species that are widely picked and 15 to 30 species that are commonly eaten. And this is going to be the last part of my talk, some of these more commonly eaten species. And then lastly, along the right side, we have 80 species grown experimentally, 40 that are grown commercially, and then really on a large scale are these 5 to 6 species that if you walk into most grocery stores these days, these are the 5 to 6 species that you can find and bought commercially in your grocery store. So a little bit about the importance of fungi. First, the good. If you enjoy your soda or pop, the citric acid in that comes from a fungus. If you, it's about a little after 5, right? 5:30. So if you're enjoying an alcoholic beverage during my talk, you can thank a fungus for that. Or if you're having any sort of cheese or bread products, all these things come from yeasts, right? That produce the alcohol or make bread rise. Um, and then there's penicillin that's actually inoculated into some of the blue black cheeses. And speaking of penicillin, that's kind of been an important discovery since World War II, right? That penicillin comes from the fungus Penicillium. So you can thank a fungus for any of these things. And then there's the bad, right? This article came out in Nature, The Fear of Fungi, several years ago. And it basically talked about a lot of the pathogens as threatening our wildlife these days. So it talked a little bit about the chytrids that attack frogs, the bat white nose syndrome that's killed over 6 million bats in the United States, a lot of different pathogens, or one major pathogen of snakes. Excuse me. And then there's a new one that I recently described last year, or year before, I guess, this shell disease in aquatic turtles. So these are all different fungi that are now attacking and parasitizing these different animals, unfortunately. So I'm going to talk about two major group of mushrooms in my introduction here, and it's going to be very brief. We're just going to talk about the Ascomycota, or referred to as ascos, and these things are easily distinguished from the Basidiomycota in that they produce 8 spores on the inside of these structures known as asci. And then there's this other group called Basidiomycetes. We just shorten it to Basidios, and they produce 4 spores on the outside of Basidia. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So if we take this morel, which most of you will probably recognize, and we split it with a knife long ways, or I'm sorry, if we split it short ways, across the top, just take a lateral section, and we look down on it and we stain it with these blue and purple stains, we can see it has a hollow stem in the middle with these radiating kind of spines. If we take one of those spines and we end up blowing it up microscopically, and then do it even more, you can see these sac-like structures with these kind of blue or purple spores inside. So this is what I'm talking about when I say 8 spores on the inside of asci. And then if we look at a mushroom, a common mushroom, turn it upside down, take a piece of the gill, and we blow that up and look at the surface of the gill, what we're looking at is 4 spores on the outside of these structures known as basidia. So that's pretty much it for the two major groups. Mushrooms are either going to be ascos or they're going to be basidios. And that's pretty much how I'm going to break down the rest of my talk today when it comes to the major groups, right? So we're going to talk about the ascos, and then we'll talk a little bit about the basidios. And this is an abbreviated talk. Of course, I'm not covering all the mushrooms and ascos, but we'll talk about briefly the morels and false morels, some cup fungi, truffles, and lichens. And this is just to introduce you to some of the common groups, the common terms. So we mostly all know what a morel looks like. We'll talk about this a lot more in my edible and poisonous part towards the end of my talk. There's also the false morels that we'll talk a little bit later about how we can differentiate these two species, these two groups of mushrooms. There's a lot of interesting cup fungi out there during the late spring and early summer, especially growing on wood chips. These scarlet elf cups, they're quite small, but very interesting to find when you see them. And then there's the other things known as cordyceps. And the interesting thing about this group is that they all parasitize bugs. So basically some sort of insects, ants, wasps. And what they do is live on the insect and then grow inside the insect. And at some point, they release chemicals that make the insect burrow down into the soil. So you can see this insect, whatever it might have been, is burrowed down below the soil, and then it kills the insect and then fruits and forms this long stalk. And this thing is actually edible. They cut it off at the soil level, and the top of it is known as cordyceps. So if you're looking for something that's vegetarian and gives you stamina and endurance, you can actually buy a bottle of this stuff, mostly sold in Asian markets as well. And then there's these truffles. So there's black truffles out there. We know and heard a lot about them, mostly in France and Italy, where these prized black truffles can be quite expensive. And then there's the white truffles as well. So for those of you that like to participate, I know we don't have a lot of participants, but and if you want to use your chat box, why don't you go ahead and guess, whoops, how much this lady paid for this white truffle at the truffle market? And I'll try to, I'll take a quick look here at my chat box and see if anyone wants to type in a number just for fun and see if you can guess um, how much this truffle went for. Okay, 250,000, 130, 500. That's a pretty good range. We have a nice range from 130 to 250,000. So the real answer is revealed. It's closer to the 250,000, right? So this thing is, whoops, it didn't. Sorry, didn't come up. There's the answer. $330,000 is what she ended up paying for this white truffle. So these things can get quite expensive. Unfortunately, no, they do not grow naturally here in the U.S., and we've just not been able to grow truffles successfully so that they taste anywhere near the ones from France or Italy. But it's a pretty good price for this truffle. And then last but not least, this is what I call the 24/7 fungi, right? Maybe not necessarily mushrooms, but these lichens that grow on rocks, sometimes soil, but mostly on tree bark around our area. So if you're out in the dead of winter and you can't find anything else, you can almost always find these lichens, which are a symbiotic association between a fungus and a green algae. And the green algae photosynthesizes and gives the fungus sugars, and the fungus provides a nice wet safe home for the algae to live in. So it's these interesting interactions between a fungus and an algae. And there's a lot of interesting colors too for these lichens. If you ever go down to Garden of the Gods, the rocks are just covered with all of these lichens. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say about some of the major groups of the ascos. I'll talk a little bit more about the basidios now. And we'll talk about mushrooms, these gill things, right? And then things that have pores, the boletes, things that look like boletes but don't have stalks are the polypores or bracket fungi. Things that have teeth are the teeth fungi, and things that look like coral, obviously, are coral fungi. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the chanterelles, some puffballs or star stinkhorns, and finally, jelly fungi. So there's a lot more major groups of mushrooms in the basidios than there are the ascos. But we have this thing known as the fly agaric. It's the most illustrated mushroom. I think you find this in all children's books, right? With this bright red cap with the white dots all over it. And this is, of course, a species of Amanita, which is known to be deadly poisonous. But that's kind of your model mushroom, right? And then there's these groups known as boletes. And if you basically, it looks like a mushroom and you turn it over and it doesn't have gills, but it has these pores underneath. These are known as boletes. And some of these with the bright yellow pores, they have a reaction to a chemical that reacts to oxygen. So if you break the pores, you can scribble on the yellow pores and they'll turn blue, right? So that's kind of a neat little thing. And most of these boletes are really not edible. You just kind of want to stay away from most of those. If they're growing on trees, typically, and they look like they're in a shelving pattern, they're a shelf fungus, or a polypore is another name for these things. And they basically do not have stalks or stipes like a bolete does. And we're going to talk about some good edible polypores later on. And then there's these things that don't have gills or pores underneath. They have teeth or spines, and they're known as the teeth fungi, right? Or tooth fungi. There's some really charismatic type fungi out there known as coral fungi, and they come in these lovely colors, these purples, and you can find them yellow and orange as well. And then there's these things known as chanterelles that don't really have well-developed gills, they're just kind of more veins or wrinkles on the underside of them. And these are definitely some good edibles that we'll want to discuss a little bit more later on. But again, I'm just kind of giving you a broad overview of some of these major groups. And then there's the puffballs. Of course, they have a hole or require a hole or fracture in the mushroom in order to puff out their spores. All the spores are encased in these round balls, so that's where they get the name puffballs, right? And then last but not least, there's these earth stars that are very much like puffballs, but they have these two outer layers. So you have this inner layer, wall layer, that looks like a puffball, and you can see the little hole there at the top of all these puffballs. But they have an outer layer that breaks back and splits and looks more like a star, kind of a star-shaped um, type thing. And they always occur on the earth, right? So on soil, and that's where they get the names earth stars. So then we also have these things known as stinkhorns, and a lot of landscapers really don't like these, or gardeners don't like these, because they almost always seem to occur on wood chips. And as the name implies, they don't smell very well at all. But this thing will come up almost overnight from this egg-like structure that's buried in the ground and produce this big white stalk. And then at the top, you have this cap that is usually very slimy and wet, and it stinks and smells really bad. But that is to attract flies and other insects to come, and they eat this mucilaginous slime off the top, and that's where all the spores are. So the mushroom is kind of fooling the insect into spreading all of its spores for us, because the insect will get it all over its legs, it'll eat it, and it'll run off and defecate somewhere, and of course spread all of the spores for the fungus. So the fungus is pretty smart in tricking the insect to spread its spores for us. And then lastly, there's this variety of different colors of jelly fungi, and they pretty much kind of look like the name implies. They're kind of like jelly, usually growing on wood. They can be yellow or dark brown or black colored or white. The brownish one in the lower left or lower right hand corner is what you end up. It's called wood ear, and it ends up what you would find in sweet and sour soup in Chinese restaurants, and they just basically cut it in long strips, and that's the mushroom you find in several different Chinese dishes. Okay, so I will take a quick break and just mention that if anyone does have any questions at all, please feel free to just type them out in the chat group. I'm more than happy to answer them as we go along, or if you prefer to save them towards the end of my talk, that's fine as well. Because the last part of my talk, which apparently isn't really going to be an hour, it seems to go a lot faster on Zoom, but that's okay, is more about the edible and poisonous species. And what we're basically going to do is go through a virtual foray throughout 1 year. So spring, summer, and fall, right? So we're going to just start out in the spring of the year, and we'll talk about the morels, and then we'll transition more into the summer with the chanterelles, and we get more into the fall then with the teeth fungi, the boletes, polypores, puffballs, and mushrooms. And you'll notice only the morels really occur in the spring. They're really about the only major edible, but a lot of us think of mushroom hunting as a spring event because of the morels, but that's not exactly true. There's a lot more edibles in the fall than there is a spring, a lot greater variety. So let's go ahead and start our virtual foray. Basically, we're starting out almost this time of year, but not not quite. Give it another few weeks, and we're going to start seeing the red buds start to flower and bud out. You will get outside, and we'll start seeing some of these creepy crawlies come out of hibernation. And since Laura said this was an adult only talk, I'll just tell you that spring is in the air, right? And most of you adults will understand what we're talking about there when we talk about all the frogs being very happy to give each other rides right now. So that's what happens in the spring. And one other thing happens is the morels, right? So what some of us do is go out and start hunting the hardwood forest, and looking for these wonderful edibles, these morels, particularly the yellow morels. And you can see there's quite a few of them around this tree for the keen eye. So Morels is in the genus Morchella. I won't go into the taxonomy too much on this. They are typically fruit in the spring throughout the Midwest in our area. And if the season's just right, and we don't get too hot or too cold of weather, they can usually last for 3 to 4 weeks in an area, right? And the cap is composed of pits. The stems are hollow and they associate with trees, but really they can be found about anywhere. So there's different kinds of morels, 3 major kinds, and one is called black morels or smokies. The other is the half-free, the peckerheads, preachers, pinheads, horse's neck. That's another group with a lot of different common names. And then lastly, we have the yellow morels or the common morels, right? And for those that are interested, the DNA studies have recently shown there's lots of different species out there. So up to 16 yellow species and 26 different species of black morel in the US. But if you're just collecting and eating these, it doesn't really matter. They're all edible and probably all about taste the same, but just a lot of different species out there. So we'll start off with the black morel. That's what you're going to see first in the spring when it starts to come up. And obviously, as the name implies, it's got a dark cap to it, right? More of a blackish cap. And if you take this and split it lengthwise, you'll see that the stipe attaches to the base. I'll see if my little arrow thing can work here. Whoops. Playing with my pointer, but yeah, so we'll see. We'll see if, no, it doesn't seem to want to work. I was trying to use the pointer to kind of point this out. Maybe that'll work better. I don't know. But if you can see my mouse, this is what we're talking about, is this attachment down here, sort of at the cap attaches at the base of the cap and at the top of the stipe right here. Okay. And then the next group that we see coming out is the half-free morels, right? They're more of a golden brownish color, not necessarily black. And if we take these and do the same thing, you can see that the cap is half free and half attached. So right about in the middle of this cap, it attaches about halfway up. And then you can see that the cap here is half free because it is attached there halfway up. So that's where they get the name half free. And just to show you one more time, we have a couple black morels on the right where it's attached at the base. And then a couple, we have a half free here that's attached halfway up the cap here. So that's kind of the difference between those two. And then as the season progresses, you know, you go through your transition from your black to your half freeze. Then you finally start seeing the yellow morels, and that kind of is an indication that the season's going to be about over, because yellow morels are the ones that typically come last. There's also this gray form of a yellow morel, but it's pretty much the same thing. DNA studies show these to be exactly the same, actually. They just have, for whatever reason, they have this large color pattern where they can be gray or yellow. And then there's this other one called a thimble cap. So this is the first time I'm introducing this red skull and crossbones. So I usually joke around and ask the audience, how many people think this is a good thing? And most people shake their heads and say, no, not necessarily. So luckily for us, the thimble cap, it's in the genus Verpa, and it's not very common in Illinois. But if you split the cap, or if you split the mushroom lengthwise, what you can see is this stem is filled with a cottony material, and the attachment is up here at the very top at the apex, right? So it looks a lot like a half free, but it's not attached in the middle. It's attached, the cap's attached up here at the very top. So between that and the cottony stem, not the hollow stem, those are two clues that tell you should probably stay away from the thimble cap. And it's not deadly poisonous, but it will make you sick. So, okay, so that's all I'm really going to say about morels. I'm happy to answer other questions later on, but that's pretty much it for morels. We are going to talk a little bit about false morels, which also comes up about the same time as morels in the spring. They're in the genus Gyromitra. They have wrinkles and not pits. Basically, they have solid stems. The caps are more reddish brown. than they are just golden brown or dark brown or black. They're generally much larger than morels, and eating is not recommended because some of the species contain toxins, which really can make you quite sick. This toxin is heat liable, so some people will say, "Oh, I've ate them my whole life," and that may be true. If you cook them really well, it breaks down the chemical if you heat it up enough, and it may not make you sick, but I wouldn't recommend taking the chance. It also can build up over time. So after 20 or 25 years of eating this, the chemical, you may just have a reaction one day, just because it's built up to a toxic level in your body, and you weren't aware of it. So false morels, most of us have probably seen these if we're out morel hunting in the spring. Like I said, they got a great big, large, white, solid stipe, and they're more of a reddish brown color. And these can be quite large. So that's an adult human hat, size of a adult human head. So it's obviously, if you've been out hunting morels for 8 hours and you're really hungry and all you can find is a giant or a false morel, I can see why you'd probably want to pack one of these home and eat it, just because you had nothing else. This is the Gyromitra esculenta, which actually contains the toxin. Like I say, it doesn't occur. This isn't real common either in Illinois. It occurs more up north in Wisconsin, but something to definitely kind of be on the lookout for. So. Okay, so now we're going to transition more into the summertime. We've kind of left April and May, and we're getting more into June and July now in our virtual foray. And we look at the chanterelles in the genus Canthorellus. And these are going to be an orange or yellow orange color. They're going to have these veins or wrinkles, but not well developed gills. Typically, they have a fruity odor when you collect a lot of them in a big bag, and they're always on soil and never on wood. And that'll be important for reasons to differentiate them from the poisonous jack-o'-lantern in a bit. So chanterelles, as you can see, have these kind of veins, not well developed gills on them, and they're quite plentiful. Usually you find these solitary, just one or two, but you can find a lot of them once you start looking for these, especially on kind of slopey, sandier slopes where they well-drained soils. And we found lots of these last summer when we had, abundant rains. A few days after rains, there's lots of them, and they're really nice edible. What you do want to be aware of is the jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, right? So again, you see this red skull and crossbones. Again, this isn't poisonous, but it is will make you sick. But you can easily differentiate it from a chanterelle in that it has these. This has well-developed gills. These caps are really huge, sometimes up to the size of a dinner plate, and they occur in clusters. On top of that, they also occur on buried wood or dead wood and not just on the soil. So you may want to dig away some of the soil, see what it's actually growing on. And these things usually occur a little bit later in the season, more towards August, September, not so much June or July. But anyway, I just mentioned this because there's one or two other things out there that are bright orange mushrooms other than chanterelles. So probably good to stay away from the jack-o'-lantern. And then we have our teeth fungi that occur in the genus Hericium, and as I say, they have teeth or spines. One of the common ones you find out on dead, usually dead oak, standing dead wood, or even fallen dead wood is the bear's head. And these are supposed to actually contain some chemicals that help with neuron regeneration. So they're doing some studies at universities now on the chemicals in this mushroom that may help with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's and things like that, these neurodegenerative diseases. But these things you can find in the fall. So starting September, October, go out in the woods and look for these things with teeth or spines. Sometimes they may be branched in this weird type of pattern, but you can find a lot of them if you find the right log. And like I said, they have teeth or spines. There's really nothing else out there with teeth or spines that's going to make you sick. So it's a pretty safe edible. And then if we look at the polypores or the bracket fungi, we have two main types, the chicken of the woods or Letoporus, or the other one is hen of the woods or Grifola. And of course, they all have different common names depending on kind of the area you're at or where you grew up. So These things have pores, not gills or spines. They grow on living or dead hardwoods, and typically, as with any mushroom, the fresher the better. The sulfur shelf or chicken of the woods is one of these common things you can find. It's bright orange on top. When you go to flip it over, you see that it has these bright yellow pores underneath, and you can kind of see why it gets its name sulfur shelf is because the color of sulfur is bright yellow, so the underneath is bright yellow. You can also find a variety. It's actually a different species known as Letoporus cincinnatus, not sulphureus, but it's got white pores instead of yellow, and that's fine too. It's perfectly edible, just like the sulfur shelf is. The other one is the hen of the woods, right, or Grifola frondosa, and it has these kind of brown leaf-like structures all over it, usually some sort of brown or gray color, and it kind of looks like a hen, sort of sitting down in the woods. You can imagine that. I like to usually just cut the tips off of this. I don't necessarily eat the stalks. You can see these things are a bit long lived, and there's a great habitat for insects. Leaves have fallen on this, sticks have got inside. So you really want to wash these things carefully if you find them. And then we go on to the puffballs. So a couple different ones in here: Calvation lycoperdon, the big puffballs, and kind of the small puffballs. The spores are produced internally. Like I said earlier, they require a fracture or hole for the spores to be dispersed, and they're only edible if white on the inside. So bacteria will grow in these and turn them a yellowish color, and that's what makes you sick, not necessarily the mushrooms. Um, so here's another quiz for you that want to type in the chat. Which one of these three puffballs would you not eat? And this is a pretty easy one. This is probably easier than the last one I asked about, last quiz. But for those of you that want to participate, yeah, Laura is exactly right. I would say it's probably the dark one here. So this is too far gone, right? This brown thing. The bacteria's got into it. Other fungi are growing on it. It's really well past its prime. But these other two giant puffballs, they're probably nice and edible. You just want to cut those open and see that they're bright white and clean, healthy looking, on the inside. There's also these other puffballs that occur on dead wood, sometimes on soil, and they're bright white on the inside as well. You want to make sure they are. But I've had these. They don't really taste like much. If you cook them in butter, they taste like something in butter, and add some garlic, they taste like something with garlic. So you kind of get the idea. But anyway, they are out there, and it's hard to confuse these with anything else. The other reason to split them open is you want to make sure they don't look like a tiny mushroom on the inside, because that could be the beginning of an amanita, the amanita egg, or they don't look like a small stinkhorn on the inside either. So just make sure they're solid white. The other reason I say that is because there are some puffballs that are not solid white. The spores turn a purplish brown color, and this is known as in the genus Scleroderma. So if anyone's heard of like a skin condition, scleroderma means thick skin. Well, the same thing here. This outer wall of this puffball has very thick skin, and you can easily recognize it once you cut it open between a good edible puffball and one of these ones that'll make you sick. So stay away from these. And then last but not least, I'll talk a little bit about just mushrooms in general. So mainly pleurotus, or these oyster mushrooms. They have these well-developed gills. They grow on dead, standing, or fallen hardwoods, and the older specimens can acquire bright yellow slime mold. So again, you always want to eat mushrooms when they're fresh, and don't let them sit around too long, or try to collect things that are old in the woods. So the oyster mushrooms, they sell them at a lot of farmers market. They're pretty easy to grow. If you buy home kits, you can grow them in your basement. I've actually had a few cases where people had water leaks in their house, and this thing was actually growing inside their house. They do obviously occur around Illinois, and you can find these in the fall, or you can go to the store and buy them as well. Either way, but just make sure they have these well-developed gills. And then lastly, I just want to mention the others to avoid. So this is, kind of covering my butt sort of part of the talk, is the Ammonites, the chlorophyllum, and anything that you don't positively know. So if you have any guesses at all, you want to be certain, and not just probably. I think there's a car commercial or into some sort of commercial on TV now, the difference between probably and certain. So you want to be certain before you eat a mushroom, or unfortunately it might be your last, especially if you get on the outside of one of these things, right? So if you ingest one of these small ammonitas, there's enough amatoxin in there to easily kill an adult human. So ammonitas are typically bright white. They have the bright white gills. They usually have this ring around the stalk right here, right? And then they have this long stalk, and usually at the base, a lot of times also covered up in the dirt or the soil is this sac or this vulva type thing. So um, they have this interesting set of features that kind of tell you that you want to stay away from that. So especially the ring around the stalk, and then the bright white gills, is means something you really don't want to mess with. Um, Here's another Amanita where the ring is not so pronounced, but you can kind of see it. It's more flattened, and definitely this cup down here at the base is grown into the stipe, and it's really hard to see. So you would need an expert to help you identify that as an Amanita. But staying away from anything that looks like this is a good idea. And then there's the green-gilled lepiota, or chlorophyllum is the name of the genus, and it's the number one poisoning mushroom that has the number one poisonings in the US, mainly because it grows in the grass and lawns. And little kids are crawling around in the grass and they like to put things in their mouth, and they take a bite of this. Luckily, it's not deadly poisonous. It just makes the kid really sick and probably wouldn't want to ever do that again. But you want to pretty much try to stay away from this. It's white on top. It looks like an amanita, but if you use your imagination, you kind of look at the gills, and they're kind of this slightish green, olive green tinge to them, right? And that's where it gets its name, the green-gilled lepiota. So it also has a ring around the stalk as well, but really it's these greenish gills that are the dead giveaway for this thing. So like I said, make sure that you know what you're eating before you go out in the woods and go hunting for wild mushrooms. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. That's the end of my talk. I know it was brief, but hopefully it gave you guys a good idea of mushrooms in general, and the ones around in Illinois. And I would be happy to answer any questions at this time if you had any.
If anyone has any questions, they're welcome to put them in the chat box now. We'll wait a little bit here. Any tips for growing mushrooms indoors?
Any tips? Oh yes, that is a very good question. Well, I've only done it once. My wife bought me a kit for Christmas because she thought it'd be funny for a professional mycologist to try to grow his own mushrooms indoors. And I had pretty good success with it. You want to basically follow the instructions, obviously, and keep the bag moist. Let the mycelium, or that white hyphae fuzz, kind of grow up in abundance. And then when the time's right, typically you're usually dropping the temperature and then making it more wet or less wet, or whatever it takes, whatever the instructions say, to get that particular mushroom to want to produce the mushrooms itself, to fruit, right, and produce the mushrooms. So, and you can usually get 2 or 3 cycles of mushrooms growing, but mainly it's temperature and water is what makes fungi grow. So anytime any homeowner says, "Oh, I got a mold problem," or "I have, any kind of mold problem," well, you get rid of the water, you get rid of the mold. That's basically it. Mushrooms only grow if you have if you have water or some sort of moisture somewhere. So, but if you're wanting them to grow, like in mushroom kits, that's what you definitely want to do, is make sure they have plenty of moisture and keep them, don't let them dry out. But yeah, good question.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Miller tonight? I don't have any questions, but this presentation was great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well,
Great.
thank you so much. All right. And I will go ahead and end my stop sharing then.
Oh, great. Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Have a good evening.
Have a good evening, everyone.